Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is one of Welsh's first serial killers, was also dubbed the Saturday Night Strangler, and this happened in 1973, so yeah, a while ago. There's actually recently been like a drama series on it and I found it very interesting, so I wanted to share it with you guys. If any of you haven't seen that or are not able to see that, just be made aware of their story is shared. And just this case is really amazing, how it's one of those where it gets solved like 30 years later. You know, the detective never gave up on it, and just not a happy ending, because obviously a happy ending would have been it wouldn't have happened in the first place, but at least this person was finally, the name was finally given out as actually who did this to these girls. But yeah, anyway, let's just get into the case. It was Sunday, the 16th of September in 1973, when a member of the public actually came across a very grim discovery of two bodies. These girls were a little bit not far apart from each other, but not in this exact same spot. And it would later be found out that they were actually best friends. Their names were Pauline Floyd and Geraldine Hughes. These girls were only 16 years old at the time, which is obviously heartbreaking. It seemed like they were brutally attacked. They had a ligature around their neck, which was used to strangle them. They had blood found all over their clothes where the attacker had actually beat them. They were found fully clothed. Sadly, they had been sexually assaulted. And they were found sort of with mud also on their soles of their feet, which led officers to believe that basically whomever this was had captured the girls, whatever, told them to undress. And I say captured, not really captured, but we'll get into that in a minute. Told them to basically undress, probably assaulted them, beat them up, whatnot, maybe to keep them in line, and had them walking around like barefoot and stuff. That's how their feet got muddy. Then told them to get themselves dressed again, basically, which is why they were found fully clothed but with muddy feet, soles of the feet. Now, it was said that Pauline was found like in the woods, face down in the mud, but Geraldine was found a little bit further away. She was actually closer to the road, so it made it look like basically, whilst the killer was maybe killing Pauline, Geraldine had actually escaped and she was running towards the main road, and she almost got there as well. But sadly, the killer caught up to her and killed her too, and then left her exactly where he killed her, basically. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about the girls, because obviously I like to start off these cases with that. Most of the time, you know, it's heartbreaking, and I like to portray who these people were, because they're not just what happened to them. So it said, well, like I said, they were very best friends. They went to the same school. Pauline was a little bit on the shy side. She was quite the opposite of Geraldine, actually, because Geraldine was more outgoing. But, you know, Pauline really enjoyed, I don't know, dressing up, doing makeup, you know, just being a typical girl. She really loved things to do with beauty. And she was just a genuinely lovely, nice person. The same with Geraldine, in the sense that she was quite bubbly. She was a lovely person as well. But she really loved music and things like that. She would actually dance around with a hairbrush as like a microphone, you know, stuff like along those lines, because she really enjoyed singing and dancing around. They both just enjoyed each other's company, were really good friends, and both loved to laugh and just enjoy their lives. And sadly, that was stolen away from them so young. They both had jobs as well. So, you know, despite being 16, they were working. They worked at this, I think it was a sewing factory. And they didn't earn a lot a week. I mean, this was the 70s, don't forget. But it was a part-time job for them, and they really enjoyed going. And I think they both worked at the same place too. So, obviously, these bodies have been found. The police come in and they begin their investigation. They're trying to find out what happened, you know, what happened to the girls. What did they last do? What were their movements, to try and figure out how they ended up here and what could have possibly happened to them. So I said they were found on Sunday the 16th, so they go back to Saturday the 15th, and it turns out that the girls had actually been out together. They went to this club in Swansea and enjoyed their night there. But one of the main things which is really heartbreaking about this case is that hitchhiking was a big thing then. It was normal. People didn't really know the dangers of it, or if they thought about it, they just, I don't know, they didn't think it was a super dangerous thing to do. Everyone did it, and so it was a normal thing to do, which is sadly what these girls ended up doing. So they ended up hitchhiking a lift home and thumbing for a lift, it's called. Thumbing for a lift. Some dude picked them up, and they never got home, sadly. After the police found out this, they put up big campaign posters and things everywhere to try and warn people of the dangers of hitchhiking, because it is just so dangerous. You have no idea whose car you're getting into. And to be honest, the person picking you up has no idea who you are. Like, I've literally, on the very rare occasion, seen a hitchhiker. And honestly, like, you want to help, but I would never ever pick anybody up, because as much as they don't know who I am, I don't know who they are. What if they're dangerous and I'm just letting them into my car? No. So it's so dangerous. Do not do it, please. But like I said, it was very common in them days. So the police basically figured that that's what happened. The killer picked the girls up. They were thinking that this person was going to drive them home. But, you know, he had other intentions and he sadly killed them. The police had a job on their hands because this is the 70s. DNA wasn't a thing then. There was a steel worker close by, the steel operating works. I don't know my words, but you know what I mean. And there was like lots and lots of people that worked there, so obviously they were going to interview all of those. They thought maybe it was an employee from there because they're close by. Maybe the girls knew this person because they got into the car with them. But then again, like I said, hitchhiking was prominent, and they just figured that it also could have been a stranger who just said that they would take them home and didn't. And there was also the theories of maybe it wasn't even people that lived in the area at all. Because you've got to think that people travel and come in and out and pass through and stuff. So maybe they weren't even from that area. Oh, as well, I think there was a fair going on in South Wales, Neath or something like that. And so people were travelling down from that to get to that too. So, you know, there was a big pool of suspects and they had no idea of anything, really. They put out a public appeal, as you can imagine. They were hoping that somebody would come forward with something, that somebody knew something. But nobody did, sadly. And they were also thinking along the lines that, you know, this was probably done in the pitch black, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a woods. It's very unlikely that there are going to be any witnesses, sadly. But obviously they try, you know, you just never know. There could have been somebody walking the dog out at that time. Who knows? So they did the public appeals. Somebody did come forward to say that they had actually seen the girls at the pub, like leaving the Swansea club. They were driving past at the time, I believe, and some car actually, they were stood at a bus stop or something, and something for a lift, and some car pulled up, and both the girls jumped in. They said that it was a male driver, but they couldn't really see anything else, but they did sort of describe the car. And it was a white Austin 1100. Problem is, they looked into these cars, and at the time in the area, that was a very popular car. Lots of people had them. So again, you know, it's narrowing it down slightly, but not enough, because so many people have that car. If it was a unique car, perfect, bang, you know, there's a couple of people it could have been, job done, but that wasn't the case. They did obviously track these people down, and they did speak to as many of them as they could and asked about their alibi and their whereabouts and things like that, you know, but it just didn't really narrow it down too much. Whilst this was happening, obviously, they had their scientists searching through the cars to see whether they could find anything that could indicate foul play or anything that, you know, maybe the girls were in that car. But at that time, they didn't have DNA, like I've already said, or anything like that. And so, because of that, the only thing that they could look for were, like, clothes fibres and things like that. Despite not having DNA technology yet, everything was really well preserved, just for the knowledge of that maybe one day something will advance to the point where these clothes and things can be tested for stuff like that. And despite all their inquiries and everything else, Sadly, the double murder case would go cold for decades. And this was until the late 90s, and it would be like 28 years after it occurred. Because by the late 90s, we're finally getting more into DNA technology. And of course, along with that comes the fact that possibly more cold cases could be solved. As I said, all the evidence with this case was preserved very well from 1973, and so they start looking into it again. The police officers in this case never gave up. It kind of niggled at them. You know, they wanted to find out who did this to these girls. They just were so focused on that. So as soon as more technology came along that could help in these cases, they were down for this case being re-looked into. So they sent off these clothing and they found DNA on it. They found some stains of where the girls had actually been raped. That was on their clothing. And so they now had, okay, that's too many nows, but you know what I mean. The killer's DNA. They just had to find a match for it. And of course, that was a humongous breakthrough for this case. Not only that, it came along with another surprise, because this DNA that they now had from these girls who had killed these two girls also matched DNA discovered on another killing of another girl. And that case was also unsolved. It was from South Wales. It also happened the same year, 1973. And it was from a 15-year-old girl called Sandra Newton. This happened just 2 months before the murders of Pauline and Geraldine. And, well, it was never matched, obviously, because, well, they had no reason to match it, link it, I suppose. So on Saturday the 14th of July in 1973, it was found out that Sandra had actually been on a night out from a club. She was trying to make her way home once more. She was hitchhiking. Again, didn't know the dangers of it, didn't really think about the dangers of it. She managed to thumb a lift from somebody, but she never made it home either. She just vanished. Her body was found, I believe, a couple of days later. She had been strangled. She had also been sexually assaulted again. Again, like the other two, I mean. And this girl had actually been strangled with her own skirt. Now, these cases did have a lot of similarities, you know. I'm not entirely sure why they weren't linked, but they weren't. Even though they happened like 2 months between as well. I guess they just never looked into that, you know, never thought that they were linked, and so that was that. Sandra's case also went cold over the years, just like Pauline and Geraldine's. But now, after the DNA technology, they were finally able to match the 2 cases, and they now were dealing with a serial killer. Like I said, Wales's first serial killer. They actually found the connection by, once again, because of the DNA technology and all of these girls' cases were cold, they also reopened Sandra's along with Geraldine and Pauline's, and so that's how they found the connection finally. But the police always believed that the person that killed Sandra was a local man. Because of, I believe, where her body was dumped, it was quite a remote area, and they just figured that it was somebody local, but they just never found out who it was. But again, they kind of found DNA on where Sandra was raped, tested that, and obviously it then linked these 2 cases. And that's where his name came from, really. You know, all 3 of these girls were killed on a Saturday night, and he strangled them, so that's where his Saturday Night Strangler came from. By the time that they actually got this DNA, the DNA database had already been established. I think that was 94, 95, something along those lines in the United Kingdom. So they did have that to sort of cross-reference it with. They entered it into the database, praying for a match, but sadly, you know, there was nothing that came back yet. So what they did, a couple of years go by, and they decided to try again, but a different technique this time, familial DNA sequencing this time. So they give that a go. The idea is in the name, you know, trying to find family matches to this DNA to then figure out who this person is, basically. Now that they had this DNA, we're in the early 2000s, and they have all these techniques that they're trying, they decide that they're gonna look back on all of the old cases, all the old suspects, everyone that they spoke to and thought was possibly involved, and they were gonna go and collect their DNA, because obviously at the time they couldn't do that because they had nothing to test it. So Now they could. They're going to go back and they're going to test it, and hopefully one of their suspects will match this DNA found on the girls. Sadly, though, you know, a lot of people had passed away since then, so obviously they couldn't get that DNA, but they got the DNA of the people off of the people that they could. In the meantime, this familial DNA sequencing thing, which is way above my head, was all still going on. And eventually, they found the person that did this, finally. A name came up, Paul Capan. This guy, he'd been involved with the police before. He car theft, I think. But at the time of these murders, you know, he would have been 7 years old, so clearly it wasn't him. I mean, there have been child killers, but probably wasn't him, basically. So they were thinking, well, maybe it's his parent or something along those lines. And so they looked into his father. He was called Joseph Capan. He worked as a bouncer of all people in nightclubs, which, you know, all of these girls went missing after attending nightclubs. So don't know whether he had stalked those or whether those were the nightclubs that he worked at or he'd seen them before. Who knows? It could have just been a chance thing. But, you know, it's quite interesting that that was his job role. Well, at least I found it. So anyway. And this man had an entire life, you know? He had a wife, kids, lived out his life. Turns out he was actually abusive towards his wife, sadly, and he wasn't very faithful. He actually assaulted her sexually numerous occasions too. He had had some relationships with minors, like a 16-year-old girl at one point, who he ended up grabbing by the throat and was very threatening towards her. Luckily, she was okay, but, you know, she was terrified and he was very aggressive towards her. And at the time, he actually was a suspect in the case. But like I said, there were so many suspects. They didn't have any way of linking anybody to it. And so, you know, he wasn't caught for it. Until now. Well, then. I believe that he was one of the people that the police did speak to. But he claimed that his car wasn't on the road at the time. Like it was broke or in the garage or something like that. Whether they looked into that or not, I don't know. But if they would have done, they would have found that it was on the road because he was the killer. So maybe they didn't look into it. I don't really know. But yeah, he was on the radar. Again, they just had nothing to fully like link him with the case. No evidence to say that he did this. So what can you do? He wasn't like to the point where they're like, this is our main suspect. We think he did it. We just don't have the evidence. It wasn't that. It was just... he was part of the suspect list, along with lots of other people. So the police go around, they want to speak to him. They find that Joseph actually passed away 10 years prior. He died in 1990, in June, I believe, and it was from lung cancer. He was 48 years old, but obviously they didn't have his DNA to prove that he did it. They just had the familial match, which was a very close match to his son. It's very likely that he did it, but they didn't have a solid proof. So what were they going to do now? Because obviously he's 10 years in the grave. Basically, they tried other tests, but they didn't really sort of fully prove it. And so they wanted to exhume his body, which finally they did get the approval to do so. And in 2002, May, that's what they finally did. They dug him up and they took their DNA samples. And they finally had the proof that they needed when these were a full match. That Joseph Capan was the Saturday Night Strangler, and he was a serial killer that murdered Geraldine, Pauline, and Sandra. He was known to float around with very young girls. He, like I said, probably saw them hitchhiking and figured it was a prime opportunity for him. He was an aggressive, vile monster, and he just saw that opportunity and he ran with it. And it is absolutely heartbreaking, especially with hitchhiking being involved, because again, today we know all the dangers, but I mean, I still see it. I've still seen it a couple of times, which I think is madness. But yeah, it's not done now, you know what I mean? But in them days, they used it as a means of transport and it was fine for them. Well, it wasn't, but they thought it was. So he just gave... That's the problem, like stranger danger. You're getting into the car with a stranger, but you're thinking, oh, well, I'm hitchhiking. I'm getting a lift. He's going to take me home. But then he doesn't. And it's heartbreaking. Not that I'm blaming these girls, because, you know, everyone did it. They probably done it loads of times successfully, and it never had an issue with it. Just so heartbreaking that this happened to them. But I'm also really thankful that finally the person that did this to them was named. Obviously, no justice could be served in that sense, like prison sense, because he's already gone, you know. And that's annoying as well. Like, he got to live out the rest of his life having done that to those girls without any punishment for it or anything. But at least the families finally got, you know, the closure that this person had actually done it to them, rather than wondering forever who did it. I'm just glad that it was finally solved, in a sense. You know, it really does break my heart what happened, and that he didn't serve time for it, never saw the justice for it. But their families can find some comfort in knowing who did this, I hope. But yeah, that's the end of the case. If you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway, that's all I have today on the case of Geraldine, Pauline and Sandra. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.